I'm excited to show you guys this recipe, how to use our Khorasan flour in the way that I prefer the most. We're making an advanced bread today, although it's really not that bad. I've tried to simplify it and make it as easy as possible for you to replicate at home. So just follow along and you're going to be blown away with how tender and soft and long-lasting this loaf is. So I'm boiling some water right now and it's almost there. That's the magic in this bread, is putting together a porridge with this beautiful organically grown Khorasan that we mill at Proof Flour Mill. Khorasan is an old Persian grain. It's about 5,000 years old. It's related to durum wheat. It's kind of a cousin of modern wheat, and it has a very rich, nutty flavor, characteristic golden yellow color. Makes for a beautiful bread on its own, but scalding it, making it into a porridge, takes it to the next level. So now that my water is coming to a boil, I'm going to start with some boiling water at 270 grams. Then half the weight of water will be this Khorasan. And that's what's kind of cool about boiling water, is crazy things happen when water boils, because all of a sudden you can absorb a lot more moisture into the grain when the water is at that temperature. It's kind of bizarre that that happens, but if you didn't boil the water, you'd maybe get 50% of the weight of the flour in water before you created soup. But you'll notice that on our mixer today, that even though I have twice the weight of water to the actual grain, I'm not going to get soup. I'm going to get something far more consistent. And I use the paddle attachment on purpose. It incorporates these ingredients well together. I don't even mind spinning it on speed 2 or even 3 because I'm releasing heat along the way, and that's productive for me in this particular stage. I wanted to make this part easy. At the bakery, we mix Khorasan scalds at mass scale, and we have to cool them down actually in our walk-in cooler afterwards, because it's way too hot to mix a dough with. Although there is one thing that you can do to just make it super simple, keep all your ingredients in the bowl and move on. This is the water that I'm going to use in my recipe, and I put it in an ice bath a while ago. I just filled up a bowl with ice and cold water directly from the fridge. Now I'm just going to pour out some of the water for myself. So my scald is now together. Nothing else to do with that. I can go ahead and turn this off. I will take a moment to clean off the paddle attachment. And of course, you can walk away at this point if you organize your life in that way and let this cool down to room temperature. There's really no harm in that, but I am going to counteract with the ice cold water, which allows me to keep going right away. My goal is to have a nice warm to the touch dough that lands in the 80s of degree. Keep in mind that the scald's probably closer to 150 degrees right now, but the ice water that I have is probably sub 40 degrees. So all of that in balance will get me where I need to go. Okay, I'm not going to throw my sourdough starter right on this hot scald. So the first ingredient I'll add to the scald is the regular type 85 central milling flour that serves as the base of the recipe. 539 grams of this. I will move to Harriet next. 136 grams of my sourdough starter. If you're off by a couple grams on the sourdough starter, it's the least of your concerns of all the ingredients. Just be careful when it comes to things like salt. So I can't forget my water. This is my ice cold water that I took out of an ice bath. 303 grams. And it's really because of this water that I'll have something reasonable in terms of temperature. I'm going to secure my bowl and measure my salt separately. It's 13 grams here. I also include 30 grams of honey in this recipe, but I'm not going to add it quite yet. I'm actually going to start the mixer and add the honey right after I get everything incorporated together. Give me a second to get my hands clean, we'll get this started. Okay, now I can get my mixer started on slow. Once all the ingredients have come together, that's where I'll slide that honey in. Now, this recipe is a little bit advanced. You have a lot more going on with the scald. The cold ice water will bring the temperature of the dough down to a good range. This dough will take a little longer to come together. It's going to be stickier than kind of a more traditional artisan loaf. Check out the other video that we recently made on a Rouge Bordeaux sourdough. That one's a little bit simpler, a little less sticky as a dough, but this one yields a really tender crumb, a long-lasting bread, and probably some of the best nuanced flavor that you can put together in a loaf. It's one of my favorites. Now that my flour has mostly incorporated, I'm gonna slide in 30 grams of honey. I expect a 5 to 7 minute mix time from this point forward to complete this. So I'm gonna let these ingredients mix together a little bit longer on this slow speed. You can even wipe down the side of this bowl to make it a little easier on the dough hook. And then I'll crank it up. The latter half of the mix we'll do in speed 4. It's gonna be a moment. If you have a nice sturdy mixer, you can probably walk away. I think it's safe even for me to walk away for at least a minute or two. And once you start hearing the noise of the mixer bouncing, you know that you've developed something, so that's a good thing. And probably need to come back and babysit a little. This mix has still quite a ways to go. It's mostly shaggy. Just need to let it do its thing for a little while. Okay, so you get to a point in your mix where the dough is still a little bit soupy, still hasn't really come together fully, but it's beginning to, and it takes a while. I mean, it really depends on that base white flour, depends on the region of the world. Our flours here, this central milling type 85 flour comes together really fast. It's generally a very strong base flour. So for us, you know, it's probably about 7 total minutes to get to a nice level of development with something like this, but you could easily double that depending on where you are. So I'm starting to be pretty happy with how this is all going. I think it needs a couple more minutes and we'll be ready. I'm gonna crank it up one more speed. I'm going to know that I'm getting closer to my finish line when the dough starts moving as one big block, as opposed to what it's still doing, which is sticking to the edge and not really pulling off the sides of the bowl. So once you see that the dough is moving together and it's pulling away from the sides of the bowl, that's typically enough development for the mixing stage. Keep in mind that you'll still keep developing this dough in your hands, quite literally, through the stretches and folds that follow this stage. And once we leave the mixer, we're going to let this dough sit in a warm place for about 3 hours, but then we'll go ahead and give it 3 sets of stretches and folds at intervals of every 30 minutes. Starting to see less and less dough stuck to the edges. It is starting to move in a more cohesive unit, and I don't know, from my eye, probably it's gonna still take about 2 minutes to get to the completion of this mix. It's certainly getting a little bit tougher now. The gluten's definitely coming together more. The mixer has to work a little bit harder at this stage of the mix, which is why I've just got my arm resting on top so that it doesn't bounce around here. Spiral mixers won't have the kind of tendency to move about as much just based on their design, but with these stand mixers, whenever you're mixing bread, you really at the very end of the mix have to be a little bit wary of the fact that the mixer might move around on you. Now it's a totally different sensation. That dough is kind of just moving in a whole big block around. That tells me that I'm getting a lot closer to the finish line of the mix here. I'm pretty happy with this dough. I'm gonna go ahead and stop here. I've got nice development, nearly passing a window pane test. I'll make up the difference of the strength just with my hands through the bulk fermentation process. If I can scoop it out in one piece, that's usually a great sign. None of it sticking to my hands. Don't expect to have the same results unless you've messed with a lot of dough in your life. You kind of gotta get good at peeling away from the dough. But this is a stickier dough. It's definitely a more advanced bread, but you should be happy with the results at the end. It's one of my favorite absolute breads that I've really ever had anywhere in the world. So hope you enjoyed it as much as I do. All right, so for this Khorasan loaf, we have to give it a fold. It's been a few hours, about 3, give or take. I've kept it in a warm place. Definitely have some rise, you can see, because if I touch the dough, I leave some depressions. So I'll just give it a nice big stretch and work my way around the bowl. I'm going to do some more work on this dough outside of the bowl. Basically tucking the edges into the middle, rolling it up a little tighter. It really helps to have the wet hands. This dough can get a little bit sticky otherwise. When I feel like I've adequately stretched it, put it back in its bowl, cover it with a little bit of flour to prevent the tea towel from sticking, and I'll put it away. It's time to give our Khorasan, slightly more advanced loaf, a second fold. It's coming together nicely, so you might have been intimidated mixing this together, but by this point, hopefully starting to gain a little bit of confidence as you see this thing coming together. Just gonna get rid of the bowl, work directly on the surface. Allows me to stretch and fold a little bit more easily. Wet hands help a lot, so don't forget to do that. You can also do this kind of rounding motion where you're tucking the edges towards the center as you round. And I can see that the skin is starting to tear in kind of these micro tear areas, so that tells me that I've taken it enough. I can put it back in my bowl, cover it up, and put it back in a warm place for one more fold in 30 minutes. All right, we're getting a little closer to shaping now. It's time for our third fold for this Khorasan sourdough. You can see that it's still holding its shape really nicely in the bowl. At this point, it's developed quite a bit of strength. I'm just gonna work directly on the table. I'll flip it over, stretch it and give it a fold, rotate it, keep doing the same thing and work my way around. This bread's going to be ready to shape within about 30 minutes. So at this point it's been 4.5 hours, so I'll be shaping it at about the 5-hour mark. All right, it's time to shape the Khorasan loaf. Now keep in mind, this dough can get a little bit more challenging than a typical artisan dough, but I think you'll be okay. Let's turn it over first on your surface. It looks nicely developed. For this Khorasan option, I made these a little bit bigger. Each of these should be closer to 700 grams. 722, 649. $6.80. Yeah, so it looks like I ended up with 2 loaves at about 680 grams of this recipe. Probably got a little bit of the water to evaporate from the boiling process, so it didn't quite end up with the full 700 each. No big deal. Kind of same thing as you would do with any round loaf. Turn it over, fold the edges into the middle. If you're sticking, use water or flour to prevent yourself from sticking. Then you can just tuck in the outer edges to make this round loaf a bit tighter. You can dip it in rice flour. If you don't have that, wheat flour, or in this case, I'm using a Buffon cap to prevent it from sticking to the banneton. Covering it up, and it's ready to go to the fridge. After a cold fermentation period overnight, we'll bake this bread, and it's going to be fantastic. I always like to prepare 2 loaves, one for me, one to share. There you have it. All right, let's see what happened after an overnight period in the fridge. Looks like my Khorasan loaf has gotten a nice rise. To the touch, I'm still getting a strong bounce back. It could be slightly under fermented, but I think it's far enough along that I can go ahead and proceed forward. The way that you can tell is just through this touch test. You want to have a little bit of a spring back, but a slow one. The faster the spring back when you indent the dough, the more likely it could be on the underside. If it doesn't spring back at all, maybe you took it over. This one is probably in an okay range. Grab my Dutch oven. Dutch oven has a little bit of a parchment liner to make it easier to take this one out later. Just turning it upside down. We'll give this one a symmetrical score. It's a little hard with the parchment sliding. Just going to do a square score. Nice and simple. Don't burn yourself at this stage. It is very important to have a preheated Dutch oven. This bread is something else with the Khorasan Scalded. When you make this at home, I hope you love it as much as I love making it, both at the bakery and for myself when I have the ability to. I'm gonna cover this up and throw it in the oven. Today I'm gonna bake this at 415 degrees and cover it up for the first 20 minutes of the bake. All right, it's time to release steam on our Khorasan loaf. All I need to do is take off the lid of my Dutch oven here, but we will take a peek because I'm too curious. Definitely don't want to touch it barehanded. So really nice separation of the ears. I'm going to have a beautiful loaf on my hands. I'm going to let it finish in this state. It's probably going to take about 10 to 12 more minutes to get the kind of color that I want, especially given that it's the Khorasan. I really want to push the color on this bread to get the most out of it. So I'll set a timer for probably 8 minutes to be on the safe side, but I'm guessing it's going to extend a little bit longer. Okay, it's been about 8 minutes. I'm gonna go grab that bread and see what's happening with it. Ah, yeah, you can see the start of color. Still quite light overall. As I suspected, I'm probably going to let it bake for another 4 minutes. All right, it's time to get that Khorasan out of the oven. Let's see if I nailed it on the color. Here it is. It's pretty nice. I think I'm satisfied with it. I'd be happy to push it a little further, but the bottom's a little dark, so I think I'm gonna leave it as is. Admittedly, I've had a little bit better luck on cast iron than with the ceramic, so something to keep in mind. I think that I might, next time baking at home, switch back out to the cast iron. I think I get a little bit more of an even bake, both top and bottom. But pretty happy with this bread overall. Can't wait to cut it open in a little while and see what it's like on the inside. It's time to cut into this special loaf, Khorasan. It's very soft to the touch. The Khorasan porridge really adds a tender element to it. Crumb should be a little denser. Should have a beautiful smell. Yeah, that's about what I would expect. You get like a bit of a almost silkiness to the crumb. It's super, super, super soft as a result of that scald. Let me go ahead and get a full slice out. This may become your next favorite loaf. Certainly around proof, it is one of ours. All right, let me give this a try. It has a little bit of an oatmeal quality to it because of the Khorasan scald. You can taste the different flavor that grain introduces into the equation. It seems like something about putting it together into that porridge only highlights the Khorasan in this bread. But on its own, Khorasan flour would yield a much denser and heavier bread. And the combination of the Type 85, the way that we did the Khorasan, will not only make this loaf last longer, but it tastes better. It has a nicer, lighter texture to it. So I really like the combination. The honey adds a nice, subtle hint of sweetness to the end as well. Did you know that you can now bake at home with the same flours that we use at the bakery at Proof? Proof Flour Mill is our new project. We're using an old school stone mill to mill 5 amazing varieties of grains that you can ship right to your doorstep in order to make beautiful buttermilk biscuits like this or loaves like that. And best yet, you can follow along on our channel where we'll show you how. Head to proofmill.com and browse our selection today.